Hello and welcome back to the Insurrections Interviews podcast and to Magic and Ecology, the series of online and in-person events, where we aim to think the uncertainty of this planet's future through the possibilities thrown up by the concept of magic or possibility itself. I am Simone Kotva, and today we're talking witchcraft, landscapes, taskscapes, proteinism, and so much more with Dr. Sidhart Pandey. Sidhart is a literary critic and historian who works on enchantment, emplacement, and the ethics of making. He is also a landscape photographer and curator, and has worked with numerous galleries and museums in India and the UK, including the Victoria and Albert in London and the Oriental Museum in Durham. Sidhart received his MPhil from the University of Delhi, and in 2019, he was awarded his doctorate from the University of Cambridge with a dissertation on crafting, conjuring, and the aesthetic of making towards a materialistic understanding of fantasy. Sidhart's dissertation looks at the representation of magic in fantasy and speculative fiction. His work upends the cliched understanding of magic as escapist, free form, and otherworldly, and demonstrates instead magic's close relationship to artistic making, landscape, and attentiveness to material becoming. As Sidhart writes, in fantasy, quote, magic, notwithstanding its supernaturalism, can be linked with embodied material manifestations that situate or ground it to configure a realm of fantastical tasks. Witchcraft and the supernatural in general are inseparable from the environment of their production. Witchcraft necessarily requires one to get dirty. Sidhart's research also engages with the politics of space and the practices of everyday life. He is a specialist on Shimla, the Himalayan mountain town whose spatial evolution from colonial hill station to its present-day complex form is the subject of his earliest work. Here he stresses the idea of mutability and impermanence, arguing that built spaces cannot be analyzed abstractly, but must be lived and experienced as changing and as sites of change. He writes about how sensitivity to the narratives of place are a prerequisite for understanding the environmental precariousness faced by rapidly expanding urban towns like Shimla. Sidhart's thinking always resists univocal explanations and digs deep into the tensions, ambivalences, and ambiguities that generate change. He is a really wonderful guide for thinking with the often misunderstood sense of what magic is, how it works, and why it might matter to the mattering of the planet. And now to help us trace the lines between magic and ecology, please welcome Dr. Sidhart Pandey.
Thank you, Simone, for that lovely, gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful series. Honored as well. And I'm really looking forward to having a great, stimulating conversation with you.
Thank you so much. Well, the pleasure's ours. And I thought we'd begin by talking a bit more about your recent work on the representation of magic in speculative fiction or fantasy. So in an article where you discuss Terry Pratchett's Tiffany Aching series, you write that, quote, Pratchett's magic is decidedly emplaced in nature, in that it springs from a worked landscape where human and non-human actors play significant, mutually realized roles. Really beautifully put. So could you speak more about magic being emplaced and what this means?
Absolutely. At the very basic level, and at the very most obvious level, fantasy almost always treats magic in terms of place. So, I mean, let's think about a couple of examples, very famous examples from British fantasy, in which I have my expertise. So I won't be referring much to other examples, but definitely from the British fantastical tradition. Thinking about, say, Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland. So that's a fantastic portmanteau, wonder plus land. And the idea of place is integral and integrated within the very notion of wonder, when we think of, say, Tolkien's works, then Middle Earth comes to mind. That is a place in itself as well. When we think of J.K. Rowling's work, it's first and foremost it's Hogwarts. And when we think of C.S. Lewis's work, then it's Narnia. So it's interesting that whenever we have to think about, or fantasists have to think about and think about magic, the almost obvious sort of corollary is place. Where would you place it? And this relationship between place and magic is something which is both obvious to me, but also equally profound, because it helps, this sort of relationship helps us situate us an otherworldly or an abstract concept in a very tangible manner by giving it the notion, the idea, and the context of a place and space. So that's how I think, in a very, very, very basic sense, place is always connected to magic. Whenever we are thinking about a magical, where would we find magic? The very notion of finding is also, it triggers us towards some sort of a place, some sort of a sense of travel, some alternate world. So that the materiality of place can never be discounted, I feel, when we think about the depiction and portrayal of magic in literature and culture and cinema and so on and so forth. Regarding this particular article that you just referred to on Terry Pratchett's works, I I wrote this article for, interestingly, for the Geohumanities Journal, which is a wonderful place again, a wonderful place to discuss the various intersections between geography and different kinds of humanities subjects. And I was specifically looking at these 5 books, which were also Sir Terry Pratchett's last books, and they discussed, they were set in the Disc world and part of Disc world. And the main protagonist, so these are the Tiffany Aching series books, and these basically discuss and portray the life of Tiffany Aching as a shepherdess, as a young girl growing into a witch, and then engaging in various sorts of pursuits of defining evil and so on and so forth. But what attracted me particularly towards these books was simply the fact that even as Tiffany grows from being a shepherdess and a farmer into a witch, Pratchett never ever undermines her role as a farmer and as a shepherdess. Even when she becomes a witch, it's really as if the skills and the sensitivity towards land and people and culture and just the idea of doing that she has inherited and learned during her process, during her becoming as a shepherdess and as a farmer, are the same skills and sensitivity that she also brings in her work, in her witchcraft work. So that's for the human relation, but the entire novels are premised on this. On this landscape of chalk, the main landscape of, it's called with the capital C, CHALK, chalk, which is her beloved homestead, which is her beloved farmland as well, and where she works as well, where she lives as well. So but the relationship between the two is quite reciprocal. So, and towards the end of the 5 books, the final book, it's called The Shepherd's Crown, and the shepherd's crown basically refers to a particular fossil that her father and his father has eventually passed on to Tiffany as heirloom, and it's a fossil that directly comes from the land, and eventually it's the fossil which becomes a kind of a magical object and helps us situate her energies and her practices as a witch. So there's a constant sort of a dual process that is being depicted by Pratchett in his books, and never ever is her role as a shepherdess and as a farmer is ever undermined. In fact, it's out of this duality of the person and the land that the entire idea of magic and enchantment arises. So yeah, it's a very fine example of how land and place and magic are interlinked in an intermeshed, very, very thick manner. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And aside from Pratchett's novels, what are some of the other works of speculative fiction that you've engaged with in your research?
Yes. So Pratchett, of course, forms a very integral part of the British fantastical tradition, and he's subverting it as well, but he is nonetheless a part of it. And the British fantasy tradition goes back to many, many years. But I was specifically looking at, in my work, on the fantasy novel form, because the novel is the most recognizable of all art forms or book forms when it comes to the exploration of fantasy. Of course, now in the contemporary era, we have fantasy cinema as the equally potent form, but in its but it's a novel form that is still quite popular in the literary sphere. So I and I was looking at the notions of both place and making and craftsmanship and how all these ideas interconnect with each other. And that took me to the very first fantasist, William Morris, who was also the great spearheader of the arts and crafts movement and the first fantasy novelist to make self-sustaining secondary worlds for the first time. So my work started with William Morris as inspiration, and who then inspired J.R. Tolkien for his works. And then it came down to Mervyn Peake, Alan Garner, Philip Pullman, little bit of Diana Wynne Jones, although I didn't refer to her in the PhD itself, Susan Cooper, and then my favorites, Philip Pullman, J.K. Rowling, Charlie Fletcher, William Horwood, all the way down. So from late 19th century onwards, all the way down to the early 20th, 21st century, I was, I looked at these people as almost, interlinked with each other and writing within the tradition of not only placemaking, but also, the idea of craft is something that connects all of them. So it's a long list of writers starting from 19th to the 21st century that I was looking at. And then, yes, I mean, I also, towards my conclusion, I was also interested in looking at the spread of these concepts in other fantasies as well. So that took me to American fantasies, particularly the works of Ursula Le Guin and Tamora Pierce, two of the finest fantasists from America, and then the contemporary fantasists N.K. Jemisin and all of these people are very, very influenced by the British fantasists, because Britain is the place for for the origin and the spread of fantasy as a genre. So these were some of the writers I was looking at.
And following on from that, I wonder what it is about fantasy as a whole, as a sort of style of thinking the world, that makes it so open to this particular generative kind of attentiveness to the non-human that you've been sketching in relation to Pratchett. And then following on from that, why do you think this ability of the genre to activate attention continues to be so consistently overlooked?
Yeah, this is fascinating and a very, very important question and a very loaded question. So I'll try to answer it in some detail. So it is not that the genre of realism or realistic writing is not attentive to various issues that fantasy is not. But yes, I would definitely say that, and it might sound as a paradox, that fantasy for me and for many other people who research fantasy and its branch subjects and disciplines like children's literature and science fiction and so on and so forth, they firmly believe that in a way fantasists and fantasy writers do have a better understanding of reality than many realist writers. And the reason is pretty simple. The reason is simply because that it is the genre, and these writers, fantasists, are very much able to make greater sense of the multitude of various kinds of entities that throng our universe, and these entities are not only human, but also non-human. So it's not that realist literature does not pay attention to the non-human world, but one of the common and most important conditions for realist literature is the centrality of human beings, human emotions, human actions, and there's nothing wrong in that. And a lot of contemporary research now, say starting from last 2 decades onwards, which falls in the broad category of post-humanism and so on and so forth, is now trying to understand the non-human aspect of realist literature as well. And there are lots and lots of theories, lots of ideas, lots of books, critical books being written on that. But nonetheless, I often go back to this wonderful statement that Ursula Le Guin made in a very prominent essay, where she said that, where she goes on to deliver what she calls a non-defining statement of fantasy. And she says that while realistic fiction is drawn towards anthropocentrism, which is basically the centrality of human beings, fantasy is drawn away from it. So, and then she adds that even though fantasy springs from the human imagination, it verges on and partakes a land or a realm where humans are not the Lord. They might not even be central to the politics of that particular land, which is a very, very interesting claim, which then links to the notion of what the critic Richard Matthews calls in his work on fantasy. He terms fantasy as the liberation of imagination, and which I find fascinating, because imagination in general is itself very liberating to all of us, right? To realist authors and writers as well. But it is true that because fantasy is looking at different degrees of reality, second degrees of reality, third degree of reality, you have to then, I mean, their understanding of what is real it's bounded to be much more sophisticated than realist authors, because it's only when you understand what is real can you think of creating alternate worlds as well. So often fantasists would indulge in creating one secondary world, but there are many fantasists where you have lots and lots of parallel worlds as well, which would have their entire own systems of codes and conducts and ethics and justice and growth and all those ideas. So I do feel that fantasy writers by definition have a much more sophisticated understanding of what is reality, and that holds true in a way for the branch discipline of science fiction as well. I mean, the historian Yuval Noah Harari, the great celebrity of our times, has sometime back he called science fiction as the most important artistic genre, literary genre of our contemporary times, because it helps us imagine artificial intelligence and non-human intelligence in a variety of ways. So I think it's this, what should I say, this almost generosity of spirit of the genre, that helps it become more attentive to the non-human. But regarding the second part of your questions, that what is it that, why is fantasy as a genre constantly overlooked? It reminds me of Amitabh Ghosh's the Indian author Amitabh Ghosh's great book on climate change, The Great Derangement. It's a beautifully written book, and it's pretty popular now, which he wrote a couple of years back, in which he goes on to say, I think in the very first chapter or second chapter itself, that it's not that issues of climate and nature have not been tackled, but that they have been tackled by what he calls the non-serious genres of literature, like romance, like fantasy, like science fiction. And then he goes on to debate as to why realistic fiction is not tackling these things. But what he does not try to get into is why fantasy is as a genre is non-serious in the first place. And for me, I think as an academic, I can say it with some confidence that the reason for this is purely academic, as in it really is it depends on the canonization of certain kinds of literature over other kinds of literature. It really is from the academia that we are coming up with certain judgments on what kinds of literature is more important and what kinds of literature is not important. Often across the world, you would have different centers for children literature or fantasy literature, because they do not fall under the, so to say, the high serious study of general literature, which would be having everyone from Shakespeare to Wordsworth and so on and so forth. And that's the truth. I mean, you find several centers, and I don't mind having different centers for these genres. But it does go on to show that there is a hierarchical perception of literature that is strongly forwarded by a lot of departments of literature across the world. When I started my research, there were very few places within India, I mean, almost negligible places within India, where I could carry on my research in fantasy. And therefore I applied to the UK and many other places. But when I came to the UK, even there I realized that the problem is not entirely solved. It's just that there were many options, but the hierarchy still remained. So I think what we regard as serious literature and why we don't pay attention so much to fantasy as a genre or science fiction as a genre is simply to do with canonization and how we think about the seriousness. Thankfully now, because of this heightened awareness regarding climate change and all, there is a huge investment in various forms of fantasy writing and science fiction writing. And when these heavyweight people like Yuval Noah Harari or other people make such statements, then of course it helps in the promotion of the genre. But the bias still very much remains, which I don't quite understand, because many times history has shown us the best of realist writers also end up being the best sometimes. Well, they also end up being the best of fantasy writers and fantasy filmmakers. Charles Dickens is equally famous for A Great Expectations and for A Christmas Carol. Similarly, Satyajit Ray, the greatest filmmaker probably of India, he's equally famous for his very realistic films, showing poverty, showing destitution, showing the ordinary man's struggles, but also for his fantasy and children's books and cinematic culture. So I do feel that anyone who has a sophisticated understanding of reality would be also generous towards understanding those things and those entities which are not humans, and that can include plants, animals, objects, inanimate life, weather, seasons, planets, anything and everything. So yeah, for me the distinction does not quite it has never been quite there between reality and fantasy, but we can discuss that later. Let's say.
No, thank you for that. I mean, it's, as you say, it's an academic distinction and a debate that on one level relates to where we study things and where we find books in a shop, but actually it's a question that's planetary in scope. So I like that you mentioned Amitav Ghosh's argument, because that really foregrounds the urgency of considering these questions of style and genre. And the way you describe fantasy literature is so different from conventional portrayals of, as you say, this low literary genre with perceived, I think, thin language, where the language somehow is secondary. Yes. Whereas you have this high realist genre where language is considered to be at the forefront. And really what we're brought to mind of is rather the thick descriptions of place that one finds in literary nonfiction. I'm thinking especially of recent writers in the UK, such as Catherine Jamie, Robert Macfarlane, and Helen Macdonald. How do you see this connection between the two genres, between fantasy and so-called nature writing?
Yeah. Another very, very interesting question, and a loaded question as well. And part of the answer actually resides in the question itself, the thick description. Because as I was saying earlier as well, for me the distinction has never quite remained quite been there between fantasy and realistic writing. And in fact, it's actually the realism of fantastical writing that has drawn me to it in the first place. It's the reality of I mean, of course, I always knew that this is not happening in the real world, but nonetheless, it's a conviction of the author, and it is the details, the sheer precision of language that attracted me to fantasy. Now, it's at the most basic level, it is precision and detailing that I think really, really joins these two genres of nature writing and fantasy writing. And of course, they could not be more apart. Fantasy literature, by definition, looks at something which does not exist, studies worlds which don't exist. And nature writing is probably the best example of, in a way, of realistic writing, because it has to do with the real world, the one earth that we all have. However, the more you read them closely, the more you understand, and both the writers for both the genres are equally interested in detailing, in these thick descriptions. So when I say the thick descriptions in a work on nature writing, right from Macfarlane to everyone else, starting from the 19th century, great nature writers, Whitman and Emerson and Morris and Ruskin and all. Whereas there, the descriptions would take us to the physicality of the land and the weather and the tactility of what they are observing and all. In fantasy also, you have this extreme sort of thickness of description when you come to spells, when you come to charms, when you come to different forms of magic, because the very fact that these different forms of magic exist in the form of spells and charms and potions and all, in which a very certain precise way of making of things is alluded to constantly, shows how much effort have the fantasy writers taken in order to build that particular kind of world, which I find very, very fascinating. So description and detailing is something which which is at the very outset the kind of link between fantasy writing and nature writing, but also various other things. Like, for instance, the concept of proteinism is something which fascinates me as well. Transformation and change. Both the genres are incredibly attuned to the notion of change and transformation. So, I mean, let me give you a couple of examples. For instance, so Alice Oswald, the great nature writer, nature poet of Britain, would be that writes in Falling Awake a line something like, where she wants to think as to, and I quote her, what it's like to descend out of the dawn's mind and find a leaf and fasten the known to the unknown. Yeah, so she's trying to think about the wind of the dawn itself, and also the mind of the leaf. But when I read Ursula Le Guin's The Visit of the Earthsea quartet, it was amazing for me to cite spot very early on in the novels that get the main wizard is, in order to learn magic, he must first understand, and as she goes on to say, the singing of the birds and the language of the falling water and the shape of the clouds. So the concerns are of someone like Oswald, who is writing of the real world, and of Le Guin, who is writing of the fantastical metaphor, are literally the same. And interestingly, you mentioned McFarlane and Jamie and Helen MacDonald and many other people. They themselves are people who are extremely influenced by a lot of fantasists. I mean, the most recent editions of Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising fantasy books have been introduced by Robert McFarlane. And he has referred to both the Narnia books and Cooper's works and a lot of other old English literature as well that alludes to fantasy. Similarly, someone like Helen MacDonald also talks about T.H. White, the great the fantasists of England. So you constantly find this kind of partaking and sharing of sources and inspirational sources and imaginative works. Because transformation and change and proteinism is something that links both of these genres pretty well. And the same goes for nature writers as well. I mean, I was talking about William Morris, who is the first fantasist in terms of writing the first secondary novels, secondary world novels of England in the late 19th century. But his work, he's also one of the great ecological thinkers of the 19th century. Similarly, John Ruskin as well. He would also be writing lots of stories on magic and enchantment, but the way they write about nature is equally enchanting. So that sort of a distinction just does not exist for any of these great writers. And then I think the third thing would also be probably, there's a certain spiritual aspect as well, or a theological aspect as well, which links both of these writers. I mean, when say Tolkien is talking about the Ents, the trees, the great white trees, or even Alan Garner. I mean, he doesn't directly refer to God, but there's a hugely spiritual presence to his novels as well. It's the same sort of spiritualism that I see also in the works of nature writers as well, because it's but obvious that a lot of natural world is perceived in spiritual terms as well. So there are lots of these parallels that exist between the two genres.
Yeah, and I'm thinking also of the literature which has become quite popular in recent years of imagining the world. I mean, this is often labeled as nature writing, but imagining the world from the perspective of a non-human animal. So like becoming a beast. And even the literature which is more just popular scientific, such as recent books on the senses of a bird and what it's like to be a bird, right, written by a natural scientist. And this also is kind of fantastical territory.
Absolutely. I mean, look at the titles of many books. There are so many of these titles existing in the market. The Secret Life of so-and-so, The Secret Life of Cows, and The Secret Lives of Bees, or The Secret Life of Birds, The Secret Lives of Animals, everything, So it's very much a thing now. And the market plays a very important and a big role in promoting this thing. But I'm all for it, I think. Of course, there are many debates that exist within these fields, and we can go in them later, but it's interesting nonetheless to see this extreme this delight in the two forms. There's also that wonderful book by, I think, Simon Barnes, which is called I'm forgetting the name, 23 Rewilding Nature, 23 spellbinding ways of rewilding nature, in which he begins every chapter of his book by quoting a fantasy text, which I find fascinating. So it's actually a book on nature writing, but I think all of his epigraphs actually derive from fantasy texts, and that's a brilliant example of how these two genres come together in a singular book.
Yes, wow. I'd like to think a little bit more about these concepts that you use in your research, that you use to give us a kind of framework for understanding magic and Ecology. One of them is taskscape, which I think is originally a term from anthropology.
Yes, yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about taskscapes?
Yes, yes. So the term taskscape actually comes from the work of Tim Ingold, the great celebrated anthropologist of our times, and one of the great inspirations for my work as well. Ingold teaches anthropology in, I think, University of Aberdeen, and his work has been very, very instrumental in shaping my vision and my understanding of imaginary worlds. Which is quite paradoxical because he, as an anthropologist, is actually theorizing about the real world. But the more I read him, the more I found him supremely applicable to my understanding of fantastical worlds. And the most important concept that really, you know, grasped my attention was the notion of taskscape. So this concept comes from Ingold's interest in the world as a process rather than a product, which is where my examination of fantasy also starts with. He deliberates that many social theories and many critical theories often think about the world that we live in and a world that we want to interpret as something that has already happened, and therefore it is set, and not in terms of processes. So what his work does, his anthropological work does, it sort of upturns this very notion of the world as set and tries to deliberate and discuss it in terms of a world that is constantly being evolved, and so that is constantly evolving. So despite all the processes, having, so to say, a finishing end, they never finish because they take on lives of their own afterwards. And in order to describe this processual nature of the world, he comes up with this term called taskscape, by which he basically means any environment that we live in, any dwelt environment consisting of humans and animals and plants and nature and non-human beings, which exists because it is constantly doing something. It is engaging in acts of being, which is never a passive act, it's an active act. Even the act of breathing is an active act. And the smallest of rituals, from cooking to bathing to doing everyday work, is actually a task in itself. So the concept of taskscape basically refers to a pattern of daily activities or daily tasks, and that's what it's like a revision of the word landscape. And because land often suggests a certain sort of a frozenness, what he does is that he replaces it with the notion of taskscape, and eventually fuses the notions of both landscape and taskscape, which I found very, very interesting and useful for my work, because it immediately made me think about, pushed me to think about the world and everything, not only the world, but the micro features of the world, everything as they are being done, as they are being evolved. So the notion of doing something became very, very, very integral to my work. And why so my basic argument in my PhD was that we need to start understanding fantastical landscapes or fantastical terrains as taskscapes in themselves, which is again not to say that realistic literature or realistic landscapes found in realistic literature can't be understood as taskscapes, but it is just that because fantasy novels and the genre of fantasy is explicitly and self-reflexively married to the concept of world building. It has to constantly imagine the building of worlds, and therefore the need to incorporate that world with certain kinds of figures who are constantly doing things or are making things, is much more, I feel personally, than it is in realistic literature. So if you look at a lot of fantasies, you will see, these maker figures. So someone is a smith, or someone is a watchmaker, or someone is a sword maker, or someone is a wand maker, Harry Potter, so many makers basically throng this universe of fantasy, and they are the kind of embodiments of different kinds of tasks, but regarding I think but interestingly, what Ingold also says is that tasks is not, or are not, the realm of human beings alone. They are also the they also result from non-human beings, which is basically animals and plants, but also much more beyond animals and plants, things which we think don't think, like stones or weather or rain or or the sky and so on and so forth. And I think what fantasy also reflects this pretty well. So even though a lot of fantasies begin with and have human figures as their central figures and protagonists who are constantly doing things, they are learning things, they're learning magic, they're learning spells, and they're learning spells by doing those spells actively in the environment of, say, a school or an academy. But often the best of fantasies would often have this one moment, later on in their narratives, when the very things that they have made also turn to have a life of their own. So one of my favorite examples is the painting in Harry Potter series, which is just the most brilliant sort of understanding of artworks, because we are never shown who the painters of those paintings are, but we know that the paintings assume a life of their own and communicate through their own mechanism of walls and corridors and frames and so on and so forth with each other, well after the painters have died. So it's similarly, say, a lot of the rings as well. The ring ultimately starts to influence you, or similarly, say, the wand. It's the wand that selects the doer and not the doer. So even though after selecting the wand, Harry and his friends go on to learn magic, but the selection of the wand is not something that is entirely human activated. It is non-human activated. So I think tasks in the concept of taskscape, because in Ingoldian vocabulary, if I can use that phrase, integrates the agency of not only human beings but also non-humans, and that's what I felt was very useful for my sort of new understanding of fantasy that I was trying to theorize during my PhD. And again, I mean, a theory given in the real world became just completely feasible and plausible for worlds that just don't exist. So which again sort of proved the point that I was trying to make, that the distinctions between the real and unreal worlds that we try to make are pretty much false and artificial.
Yes, that something doesn't need to be factually true in order to be true. Yeah. And
a beautiful point. Yeah.
And this is so fascinating for several reasons. One of them that just keeps coming back to me as you speak is that it really throws a new light on this idea of human crafting, because we know that the idea of human intervention is contested, right?
Yeah.
And that one of the main ecological questions is how to promote human technological know-how without imposing that, right? And I sense in your interpretation there's a delicate balance that you say needs to be struck between letting be and making. We can't really have an ecological thinking if we try and bracket out this whole idea of crafting. And part of that is to extend the whole idea of techne to the non-human as well. So we're not the only crafters, but we're co-crafting together. I mean, there's a lovely place in your article where you write, the hand works the land and the land works the hand in a decidedly mutual manner, and out of this equation originates an enchanted terrain which is necessarily ethically oriented. Could you speak more about that sort of necessary link from enchantment to ethics and craft?
Yes, and craft. Yeah. So so making is often thought to be a human thing, and therefore because of, I mean, whatever we have been seeing in the world, and it is negatively loaded as well, of course. But the real kind of making or ethical making is not necessarily antithetical to the notion of letting be either, which you just mentioned. And particularly when it is shown by fantasists and by nature writers, it assumes a certain ethics of its own. So let me explain it with some examples. First of all, that the notion of making itself incorporates a lot of other ideas, like one of them being, say, rhythm, other being skill, other being concentration, but the notion of rhythm and design and those kind of things, we assume that they are only human notions, but they are not. I mean, rhythms existed in nature even before humanity arrived, on scene. And similarly, like Tim Morton writes, I think in one of his books as well, that design is not the sole prerogative of human beings. Nature herself is a craftsperson. And it is stupid of us to think that we have some sort of a mastery over it because we can design things and nature can't design things. I mean, look at everything, anything around you, and it has a perfect design to itself, right? From the trees to the plants to the weeds to the skies to the clouds, everything. So I think first of all we need to stop thinking about making as something that is purely antithetical to the natural world, and then also to think about it in in relationship to nature. So you have multiple fantasists who would be exploring this notion of making and natural growing almost together. I refer to William Morris, and he's probably the best guide to understand this kind of a concept. So even though he's writing in his utopias and in his fantastical romances, he's writing a lot about these very well-crafted worlds with beautiful architecture and beautiful clothes and beautiful jewelry, and if everything is suffused with a kind of beauty, but it is a beauty that is perfectly in sync with the natural beauty, the beauty of the natural world. And so the descriptions of the natural worlds elicit the same sort of attention by him that the descriptions of the crafted worlds also elicit. He then influences someone like J.R. Tolkien, who is the master fantasist, and from where the modern fantasy genre also takes off. And Tolkien, in his legendarium, the Silmarillion, particularly, writes about the making of a particular tree, the two trees I'm forgetting the name of the place, Valinor. Yeah, the two trees of Valinor, which basically store light, the spiritual light and the actual light of the world. So it was fascinating for me to read that thing, because trees were also thought of as crafted, and yet at the same time they were natural beings as well. And because the evil person, the antagonist, Melkor, understands that all the light of the trees, all the power of the world resides in these two natural objects, he wants to cut them, and he wants to eventually, destroy them. And then, but the light of the trees then eventually comes to be stored in three crafted objects, which are basically the silmarils, the beautiful gems, and so that is where the sort of boundaries between making and natural growth almost sort of diffuse or die down. And my third example would be Philip Pullman's works, his Dark Materials series, and now his most recent work on the Book of Dust, which have already had 2 volumes out. And it's at the end of his Dark Materials series that he tries to explain the role of the force of dust, which is the main supernatural magical force, constantly pervading the discussion. Hello, can you listen to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So it's a role of dust. Towards the end of the third book, which is the Amber Spyglass, one of the main protagonists, Mary Malone, has the charge of making this particular instrument called the Amber Spyglass. And Pullman goes in great detail in order to show that process of making of Amber Spyglass. The sheer handwork and the energy and the labor that is involved in making something with which she can eventually see the force of dust as well, for the first time, as these beautiful golden particles. And it's through that act of making that she ends up also saving the world, because dust is equated with consciousness in those books, and it's basically being wasted, but it is through that act of making that she finally retains some aspect of it. And it's interesting that Pullman, in order to celebrate dust, also says that dust often accumulates around things which are humanly made, which I find very fascinating. And it's an idea that it continues even in the Book of Dust, the first volume, La Belle Sauvage, where which takes place 10 years before the first book of his Dark Material starts off. And that book is equally interested and invested in a lot of maker figures. So there's the boy Malcolm and his boat, which is a very well crafted boat. And throughout, Pullman is incredibly inspired by William Morris's ideas and many other ideas of various craftspeople. Craftspeople and people who have theorized on crafts, like Ruskin, like Morris, and many other arts and crafts writers as well. So I think fantasy similarly similar things can be said about Alan Garner's works as well. So I think there is definitely a certain a certain way in which the making of magic meets the or gets inspired by the making of nature itself and by natural rhythms, and the two have to work together in order to lead to some sort of an ethical culmination as well. The moment ethics is lost, the person, the maker, basically becomes a bad figure or a dark figure, so to say. I mean, in a way, Voldemort in Harry Potter series is also a maker because he wanted to make all the 7 Horcruxes. But his understanding of making was completely different from other people's understandings of making, because to make the Horcruxes you had to kill people, and killing was basically going against nature. So I think ethics is something which is profoundly at the heart of a lot of depictions of fantastical making, and it is out of that ethical sense that enchantment is often configured by these fantasy writers as well.
So we've spoken now about your research on imagined places, but you also work, as we mentioned at the beginning, extensively on the aesthetics and ethics of real places, principally the spatial evolution of your hometown in the Himalayas, Shimla.
Yeah.
And I think although the subject matters may seem quite different, there's this fascinating commonality between these two aspects of your work, even a kind of reciprocity, especially regarding what you've just been talking about, making and so on. And I was wondering whether you could say more about this.
Exactly, yeah. I love speaking about Shimla because it's a place that's closest to my heart. Even though we now don't live in Shimla, I'm speaking from Delhi. And the Himalayas are far off, but it has just snowed in the higher hills of Shimla today, and I'm longing to go back. So yeah, Shimla is it's one of the most famous towns in India, touristic towns, not only for Indians but for foreigners as well. It is a town that came into being during the middle of the 19th century by the British, who had by then settled in India and colonized almost all the parts of the country. But they couldn't help but feel the heat and dust of the plains, so whether it was Madras or Calcutta or Bombay, all these places where they had their main centers of administration and trade, they were pretty much hot cities because India is essentially a tropical country. And they started sending these people, cartographers and travelers and so on and so forth to the higher hills to explore the higher hills and highlands of India, and eventually ended up setting up what came to be known as hill stations. And Shimla it was the most famous of all of these hill stations, lying up in the middle Himalayas, from where you can see the greater Himalayas as well. And it was made the summer capital of British India in 1864. And so half the year, the government of the imperial government would shift from Calcutta during the summers to Shimla for 6 to 8 months, and then during the winters it would come down. So there was an entire politics of weather and environment informing the setting up of this landscape as well. And then it came, lots of things of events of historical importance happened here. Rudyard Kipling lived here. He wrote about it prolifically. Then the partition of India was decided within Shimla, and so on and so forth. And a lot has been written about the Britishness of Shimla, because Shimla eventually came to be known as a home away from home. People who could not go back to Britain or England, or wherever they were coming from in Europe. This place was almost developed as a kind of a copy, so to say, quote unquote, copy of rural England or of rural Britain, So it came to be known as Little England of India, and it came to be punctuated and not punctuated, but defined by these amazing kind of eclectic architecture, which at the sight of it would remind you immediately of the neo-Tudor architecture of Britain, or the chalets and the Victorian villas, and even now most of the architecture is there intact. So in a way, Shimla came to define the greatest fantasies of British. It was the greatest material expression of the British fantastical imagination in a colonial space. And even now, if you just Google it, anyone can Google, and there are lots of photographs that which will just completely shake you, because you will be immediately transported to a Scottish baronial castle up in the Highlands of Scotland, or some Tudor architecture, and many other examples like this. So I have lived in Shimla we lived in Shimla for the last 10 years. And before that, we were living in other parts of the Himalayas, which are the pre-colonial parts. And those too have a certain magic of their own. But I'll concentrate only on Shimla. So the magic of Shimla as a place derives specifically from its urban culture, urban layout, urban planning, and its architecture. But also because of its intersection and interaction with the natural splendor that surrounds it. Now, it's interesting. We are living in the time of decolonization, and many new decolonization movements are going across the world, and asking us to revisit our colonial pasts and think about indigenous cultures and likewise. But it's very interesting for me as a historian of the Himalayas to see Shimla develop in the last 70 years of independence of India after 47 into a very, very well-loved and well-cherished town. I'm yet to see a place or meet people of a particular place who would how to put it, who would describe such a fierce love and connection with a particular town, And it's interesting because all of these people are actually Indians, and you would expect, given the new ideological debates on decolonization, to have a certain hatred or to have a certain frictionness, as it were, within your mind when you're talking about a place which is essentially a representation of colonial power and imperial power in its heyday until 1947. But what interests me as a historian is precisely this: that instead of that, it has actually evolved into something which is much more loved, much more cherished by normal people. It's a love that cuts across all castes, all classes, even genders. So and that is the love that I have been trying to historicize, theorize, philosophize through my various writings, through my various interviews, through my photography. I'm a visual artist as well, in the last many years. So it's that love that defines the fantasy of the British, but also almost like a fantasy of Indians as well. And so yeah, it's a lot. My work on Shimla formed my first work, and when I was shifting into my research in fantasy, a lot of people said, "Why aren't you continuing researching the Himalayas? What's the connection between researching a real historical place and fictive alternative universes in fantasy literature?" My answer would be simple: that Shimla served as the biggest fantasy for the British, and whenever I would be taking these walks, or interacting with people, or just soaking in the natural environment surrounding that beautiful architecture and urban layout, I would be immediately both in a realistic landscape but also in an imagined landscape. And it is at that particular it's at that particular level that my two research projects sort of come together.
And I'm reminded of how in your work on Shimla you write about on this topic of the importance of carefully studying continuities and discontinuities. So about paying attention to the different narratives that shape a city, any place really. And we've spoken about it already, and you write about it a lot in your work on fantasy. magic really as attention, as the education of attention, and then nature writing as well as this kind of exercise in attention. Attentiveness to the non-human becomes the method for conducting cultural geography in your work on Shimla. And I find this so fascinating because the need to educate attention and to train perception, not just the eyes, but I mean, this came up with in your reflections on the taskscape, sort of the hands and the smell in every sense, is an idea that keeps recurring among those addressing what's called like ecological thinking. I mean, Timothy Morton, Isabel Stengers, all talk about attention specifically as something we need to regain or reclaim as a form of magical thinking. So can you say more about the tension between your works?
I think first and foremost, and this is something that Shimla made me realize, and then my time in Cambridge as well, that attention is not solely the prerogative or the product of the mind. It is very much an embodied thing, as it were, and that is what we need to understand first and foremost about attention. It is not something that is only mental in nature. It is very much physical and physically felt. I think much of my research in Shimla and in the Himalayas has taken not so much on while reading books or while sitting on the table, but while taking these very long walks in the town. And unlike, I'll talk a little bit about Shimla because it connects to this point that I'm making. Unlike a lot of European towns which are amenable to walking, the modern architecture of India post 1947 somehow did not pay enough attention to cities that would be made around the notion of walking or around pedestrianism. But Shimla and many other hill stations thankfully retain that particular enchantment of walking still, although things are changing very rapidly. But nonetheless, there is a way in which people connect to the town because they find it very, very amenable to walking. That holds true for me as well. And it was during these long walks that I would be taking for years together that I would meet people. I would be, spellbound by something, by a piece of architecture, or by a cedar tree, or by a cone on that tree, or by a stimulating sunset, or anything. It is during that act of walking that I understood most of all that attention and attentiveness is not. It is just not at all the prerogative of the mind. It is very much something that happens throughout entire body, and it links to this another beautiful idea of presence, which is something again that a lot of fantasists and a lot of nature writers and a lot of spiritual leaders also talk about. It's something which is constantly sort of evoked in order to make us more appreciative of the world that we live in. And I'm reminded of Rachel Carson's wonderful quotation when she says that the more clearly we can focus on our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe, the less taste we shall have for destruction. And I think it's wonderful because this quote basically summarizes everything, that wonder and attentiveness often go together. It's a false notion that if you start wondering, you will turn escapist, and that escapism will basically take you out of yourself, and you won't be able to associate with the world. That might happen for some time, but I think the role of all good attention is to bring you back towards the intricacies of the world and to make you appreciate. And it's not just Rachel Carson, Simone Weil, and Iris Mudrock, and Jane Bennett, another person who has influenced me a lot. They've all linked attention to this certain generosity of thought. And because it helps you, again, coming back to the notion of place, it helps to situate yourself within what is happening around you. It makes you attend to not only your own internal self, but the external world as well. So I think attention is something which is definitely and you're very right in calling it almost a method, as it were. So of course, all of us have heard this phrase, when you're not concentrating in your school work, that pay attention. But that's a very crude form of attention. That's not the kind of attention I'm talking about. It's a much more free flowing, and yet in some ways also activated kind of an attention, which is very much in sync with the rhythms of the natural world, and also with the rhythms of the cultural world. I mean, if that culture is made in sync with nature, whether it is, you don't only have to talk about the colonial architecture of Shimla. If you talk about the pre-colonial architecture of a lot of villages and in India, or for that matter any other part of the world, you will understand that architecture is very much attuned to the rhythms of the world where it is growing from. It would make you attend to the surface and to the land from which it has been made of, or from which it is growing. So attention, I feel, yes, it's a beautiful concept. It is essentially an embodied concept. It is not esoteric. It will help you wonder about lots of things, but eventually it will help you ground your thoughts. So that's basically, I think, about attention. That equation with wonder and generosity is what I feel really attracts me when we think about attention as an embodied concept.
Yeah, that's so important what you say about this embodied quality. I'm reminded of what Isabel Stenges, who'll be speaking on the podcast later on, talks about when she describes attention as having to be slow and slowed down. The kind of two different modalities of an attention which is very fast paced and one that's slower.
Absolutely.
You could talk about it as the difference between paying attention and being attentive. One where you're kind of open, and the other one where you close down by honing in on something specific. I think that's.
I mean, and if I can add, I mean, this slowness, what Ingold calls temporality, and what another person, sociologist Richard Sennett, in his work on the craftsman, he also talks about slowness and the notion of labor. All of these things are very intrinsically tied to the notion of good ethical craftsmanship. So it is, it's. I mean, and it just goes on to show that it's the very notion of human craftsmanship is not at all divested from what is actually happening in the natural world, which also takes its own time, which also has its own slowness. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that probably brings us to our final question, sadly, because we could go on and talk about this for a long time. I think that a lot of our listeners perhaps have been curious all along about why this concept and practice of magic, and why now, because it seems that magic couldn't be further apart from the other thing we're talking about, which is ecology. Because ecology is about attending to the material present, while magic is about invisible, immaterial realities. So the way your research challenges this is really striking and so timely, because it makes us see not only magic in a new light, but more importantly, this thing that we call ecological thinking and acting again in a new light that makes the two inseparable. Brings us back to the fundamental practices of attentiveness, craft, and making, on which both of these depend, both magic and ecology. So I was wondering whether you had any closing thoughts on the relationship between magic and ecology more generally, as you've come to discover it through your work.
Yeah, I think I should share an example first and foremost. When we were in lockdown, and I think we should talk about the lockdown period, because that's what has defined our lives the most this particular year. And India had one of the strongest, fiercest lockdowns anywhere in the world. I think one of the best we were in Delhi, and one of the best news that I received within a couple of weeks of being in the lockdown was that for the first time in more than 3 decades, the Himalayas were visible from the plains of the Punjab, which is a state just above Delhi. So it lies within the plains of North Indian plains. For the first time, the Himalayas were visible almost 200 kilometers away. Just in your field of vision. And that was probably the most magical thing to happen. Never had people of my generation, this generation, had thought that you could see the Himalayas from literally the fields, and that is the reason was simple, because there was no traffic, there was no human intervention for months together, that it cleared all the air, and and the air pollution level, which by the way, day before yesterday was a Hindu festival of Diwali in Delhi, and the air pollution index had crossed that particular day 1,000 mark. It was I mean, it was beyond severe and it was beyond hazardous because of lots of firecrackers and all. But during the lockdown, for the first time, Delhi and the plains of, other plains of India, surrounding plains, showed less than 20, 30, which was never ever heard of, And what that did was that it cleared the air, and it showed these magnificent range of snow-clad mountains visible from 200 kilometers away. And the only thing that people were saying is, this is magic. There is no other magic than seeing snow cloud mountains from the flat plains of India, from so far away, which you have never ever seen. And there were different kinds of magic happening every other day as well. So you would have the news of peacocks and deers and this and that, just walking very comfortably and confidently on the roads on which human cars would ply, So and it's sad. I mean, I completely recognize the other aspect of this as well, that it is because of pandemic and it is because of human suffering that we had to impose this particular lockdown. But it also goes on to show that nature does have a magic of its own. It's a magic and a rhythm which, if given time, and not much time, I mean, these things started happening within few weeks. That's it, that it will show a certain magic of its own. So why I'm talking about this particular example towards the end, with this fine question, is simply because this was the most magical thing to happen. We couldn't see the mountains from Delhi, of course, because that's way too far. But just few kilometers above Delhi, you could see the Himalayas from there. So I think that the I mean, magic is very much integral and integrated within our common vocabulary itself. It is true that it has very many meanings, and many of those meanings we haven't even discussed in this in this talk. It has associations with occult and superstition and black magic and so on, and we have not talked about that. But in a very general sense, it is something which helps us sustain ourselves as human beings. So, and you talk about, you were saying that, nothing could be, I mean, the materiality of ecology and the immateriality of magic, and nothing could be, more separate from each other. But I do believe that anything that we like or that attracts our attention, when it enters the realm of perception, say it can be a beautiful building, or it can be a beautiful flower, or anything that attracts us or excites, us because of its sheer beauty. And here I'm paraphrasing the works of the great Harvard critic Ellen Scurry. Anything that enters us, it immediately assumes a certain fluidity, and it's a fluidity that basically overpowers the materiality of the thing or the body in itself. So it immediately sort of expands within our field of vision, because that's exactly what imagination does. It makes everything fluid. So it ceases to matter whether it's a smallest of ornament or the hugest or the biggest of mountains, but whatever enters, it immediately becomes, for at least some time, it becomes magical. It becomes fluid, because that's how imagination and perception actually work. So in a way, imagination itself is magical. By definition, human imagination is magical, in by nature, and pun intended, of course. And the other thing, yeah, I mean, if you look at some other examples, would include, say, the prolific work going on within the field of nature writing and nature painting and nature drawing. I mean, if you look at, say, the collaborations of Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris, they're brilliant books on the lost words and now the lost spells. They have sort of led to a magic of their own and to a life of their own. They are very much writers working, at least Macfarlane is a writer working within the natural and the realist natural tradition. But whatever performances they have been having together, whether at Albert Hall or whether at various other places and all, it's that act of painting those beautiful animals and birds and words and spells that immediately assumes a certain, that makes those real animals and real birds and real language assume a certain a certain magicality of themselves. So I think where these two, magic and ecology meet, are simply at the level of wonder, or what I call wondrous aliveness. That's a term that I constantly use in my PhD, that both of these entities, both of these concepts, ecology and magic, thrive on a certain sentience, on a certain aliveness, on a certain attentiveness. They make you feel attentive. They make you feel alive from within. They do not partake any sort of stasis or staticness. And I think it's there that both of them come together beautifully and gel together beautifully with each other. I mean, it's often one of the most common sayings is that change is nature, or nature is change. But then magic is also change. I mean, magic is a magic because it changes, you know. So eventually it is at the level of aliveness and at that level of transformation, both internal transformation, imaginative transformation, and external, which can be political, which can be artistic, which can be whatever shape. But it is at the level of change and transformation that magic and ecology actually meet and beautifully sing with each other. So yeah, that would probably be my final comment.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly rich and yeah, generative. I hate to break this off, but I think we'll have to wrap up, and it just remains for me to thank you for stopping by the podcast and for sharing your truly sort of, I don't know, kind of mind-opening work with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Simon. It's such a pleasure and an honor to talk about my PhD. I finished writing it 2 years ago, and and I'm happy that you gave me this opportunity to talk about it again in a popular platform. I hope that I hope that my ideas have made some sense, and I'm really grateful and looking forward to many other talks on the podcast as well.
Thank you. Well, listeners who want to learn more about your work, please check out links in the description box and the feature post on the Magic and Ecology website. Sidhart also runs a wonderful Instagram account at Shimla Sidhart Pandey, where he regularly puts up posts regarding his work on landscape and wonders. So I encourage you to have a look at that as well. And now it only remains to thank you, our listeners, for tuning into the Insurrections Interviews podcast. The podcast is part of Magic and Ecology, a year-long series of talks and online events where we invite researchers thinking about magic in relation to ecology and practitioners working with magic to transform modes of earth living in order to enable collaborative thinking across disciplines and practices. Magic and Ecology is hosted by CRASSH, the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge, and co-convened by Hjørdis Becker-Lindenthal, Sophie Lunn-Rockcliffe and myself, Simone Kotva. For more information and details of how to sign up for our upcoming live online events in 2021, please visit our website at magicecology.crash.cam.ac.uk.